Hello, and welcome back to Policy Voices, the podcast from Friends of Europe. I'm your host, Sabina Șancu, and today on the podcast, we're going to be discussing global economic flows. It's something that's been on everyone's mind recently, especially at these times of insecure geopolitics. Together with my colleague, Francisco Lopez, who's in charge of our flagship program, State of Europe High-Level Roundtable, and also of our Global Europe program, we got to talk to Tiago Devesa, who's a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, where he leads research into the future of globalization, including flows of trade and capital. Tiago studies how these flows affect our material and energy world and how they may shape the industries of the future. And the place that he works for, the McKinsey Global Institute, is a think tank that provides a fact base to aid decision-making on the economic and business issues most critical to the world's companies and policy leaders. You'll hear Tiago mention a lot of research that MGI has done, and all of that you can find on the internet. On our website, you can find a couple of the reports linked. So without any further ado, here's mine and Francisco's interview with Tiago Devesa from MGI. Yourself, as a part of the MGI team, have worked on several reports in recent years where you especially worked on the geometry of global trade. Could you explain a bit how global economic flows are being affected by geoeconomic trends, especially, in our less stable world recently?
So in our work in MGI, we try to study what we call global connections. How are the different economies of the world wired together? And as we've been looking at this over the past few years, the core of the story that we see is global connections of trade, of capital are here to stay. They're not going to go away, but they are getting reconfigured. So the wiring that connects our world is changing in ways that are sometimes a little bit surprising. And the final thing that we see is that the changes we've seen to date are arguably the tip of the iceberg. We think that there's much more to come. So let's break down each one of these into a little bit of pieces. One, why do we think that flows of trade and capital are not going to go away? Essentially, when we look at the different regions of the world, we see that every one of them, I'm going to give you a number, every one of them depends on others for at least 25% of a critical good, be it a manufactured good, be it a resource. So if you're in China, that might be soybeans that you need to buy from Brazil or the US. If you're in Europe, as most of us know, that might be energy that comes from other places in the world. If you're in the United States and North America, that might be electronics. So each region has different dependencies, but they all have dependencies. The way we usually like to call this is no region is an island. So the question is, what type of connections are we going to have? And there, what we see is, I think something that most of us intuitively know is that trade is changing. But how is it changing? There's a lot of narrative that we usually see when we talk to people around regionalization. Regions are going to create shorter supply chains. We're going to see a much more local world. It's going to be much less risky. When we look at the data, do we really see this? Not really. It's not in a global perspective. So what we try to do is actually we measure how far does the average dollar of trade go. So if you picture a container ship with a bunch of goods inside of the container, on average, if you go from point A to point B, how far does trade go? And what we see is that actually over the past years, that distance is pretty static, around 5,000 to 5,300 kilometers. That's just very roughly London to New York, just to get that idea in your mind. And that distance is pretty flat. So we're not really regionalizing. We're not shortening supply chains. Trade from that perspective travels as far as it ever has. So that got us thinking a little bit, look, if it's not about geographic distance, if it's not about kilometers, what is it about? Like, what's the right way to look at the world of trade if we want to understand how it's changing? And we came up with this concept that's called geopolitical distance. Let me try to break it down a little bit. So instead of measuring the kilometers that separate the countries, we measure how far are they geopolitically. And this is always hard to do without image, but let's picture in our mind the scale. And we have at the left-hand side, a country like the United States, a country like the UK, countries like Japan, that are all relatively together, not geographically, but geopolitically. And then you can imagine at the very far side of the scale on the other side, a country like China, a country like Russia. And then, of course, a bunch of countries spread out throughout the middle, be it Brazil, be it Mexico, be it Vietnam. So when we build this scale, which is based on UN voting records, a few other things, we basically create an algorithm that clusters how close or far countries are, but it's fairly intuitive. We can then use this like say ruler to, instead of measuring kilometers, measure geopolitical distance of how trade is changing. And what we find is that by this measure, the geopolitical distance of trade is actually falling quite a lot. What does this mean? It means the US is trading less with China. Europe is trading less with Russia. The countries at the very far ends are trading less with each other. And probably intuitively, that means that they're trading more with either the partners that are very close to them, so Europe trading more with the US, or at least partners that, let's say, are less far. So for example, US buys less from China, buys more from Vietnam. So this is the strongest signal that we see in trade today, is this decline in geopolitical distance on the poles. And actually for the countries in the middle, that means that they actually trade more with both sides of the poles. It's the reverse side of this coin, which leads us, and this is the last point I'll make, to a little bit of, I said in the beginning, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Why do we say this? Because actually, if you think about the changing world of trade, it takes a long time. Like you need to build new factories, you need to sign new contracts, you need to build new infrastructure. So actually trade is a little bit like, you're trying to steer an aircraft carrier. It takes time for the ship to actually move around. So we try to ask ourselves, like, what is something that moves faster and that we can look to for clues of the future? And what we found is that's basically capital, right? It's much easier to announce new projects, to invest in new locations. That reacts much faster. So what we looked at, and it's going to be a bit of a mouthful, but it's this idea of announcements of greenfield FDI. What does this mean? Essentially, multinationals announcing that they're going to build a new factory here, miner announcing that they're going to build a new mine there. Basically, how are multinationals reshaping their footprints? And when we look at this indicator, what we see is that the geopolitical signal of this indicator is actually twice as strong as the one of trade. So this is essentially saying, look, trade is already shifting. It's shifting geopolitically, but then multinationals are investing to change that trade even more in the future. So the investments of today are going to get reflected in the trade of 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So that's the bottom of the iceberg, that it is coming. It's not hit us yet, but it is certainly going to play out.
Going from this global perspective to a little bit more into Europe, given increasing trade tensions and for reasons beyond economic matters, including security concerns, the EU has been developing this strategy to diversify its trade, its investments. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? How is the EU diversifying its trade and investment partners?
I think probably the most intuitive place to start is probably Europe and Russia, right? That's the first thing that our mind goes to. And indeed, the strongest signal when it comes to Europe's changing relations with the world is the fact that Europe decoupled its energy and material system from Russia. So there's natural gas that I think that's the most widely understood one, where I think the latest figures is Europe has probably cut 2/3 of the amount of gas that it used to import from Russia, maybe a little bit more in the past few months. So that's a very strong signal. But it's not just natural gas, by the way. There's nickel that Europe used to buy a lot from Russia, much less today. There's much less oil being bought from Russia. And this means that Europe had to find, because these things, Europe continues to need them, Europe had to find new partners. And to a big extent, they ended up being partners that are relatively more geopolitically proximate. So the United States is by far the strongest signal when it comes to gas and oil. There's a few other partners as well. So the first big signal is much less energy and materials from Russia, much more from other places, in particular the United States, in the form of liquefied natural gas. Important to caveat, this isn't true for every single thing. So for example, for fertilizers, there hasn't been a massive shift away from Russia in the amount of fertilizers imported. And so there's some interesting stories there. If we move away then, let's think of Europe more broadly in terms of other partners. It's also interesting that while the United States, for example, has reduced by quite a lot the amount of gross imports it gets from China, in Europe, that's not the case. There's certain sectors where that has happened, but on the other hand, there's much more import in particular of clean technologies and in particular electric vehicles and batteries. Also interesting to think a little bit about is like, what are the blind spots is a strong word, but what are the other economies in the world that Europe hasn't massively increased engagement with, but could in the future? And I think the answer there is a lot of these, what we call middle-aligned economies, a lot of countries in Latin America, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that the US has massively increased engagement with Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. Whereas for Europe, that signal isn't as strong. And for example, thinking of India as well. It's interesting because we built some simulations of the future of the global trading system over the past 10 years. And we kind of threw a bunch of scenarios at it to see how trade might look differently. And one of the signals we saw, for example, is that the corridor between Europe and India is what we call the safe bet. Kind of doesn't matter how much you stress the global trading system, Europe and India trade kind of went up in all of our simulations. this is all trade. It's also worth, let's go back then to the idea of capital as a bit of a leading indicator of what other relationships are getting formed for the future. The strongest signals there is that Europe did increase the amount of foreign direct investment that it attracted from other places. It's actually quite good, about 40% more per year now after the pandemic than before. For calibration, the world went up by 25%, so Europe outperformed, let's say, until you compare it with the United States, because the United States actually went up by like more than double. So Europe outperformed, except versus the United States. So it's interesting to disentangle a little bit. Look, what has Europe done versus the United States in terms of investment attraction, like partnerships that are getting formed, right? And so where Europe increased partnerships quite a lot were in the areas of investment into its data center infrastructure. That's kind of the biggest area of growth, in particular from American hyperscalers, probably not surprising, by some investments from the Gulf as well. And then another area of very interesting, and obviously with a lot of nuance, attraction has been actually Chinese battery and automotive players investing in Europe to create new gigafactories in Europe, new assembly in Europe. So those were, let's say, two engines of Europe attracting more inward capital. When you compare it to the United States, what's notable is one gap, which is the biggest source of US increased attraction of investment was from what we call advanced Asia: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. These three accounted for about 2/3 of the growth of US investment attraction in things like semiconductors, in things like batteries. Whereas for Europe, I'm not going to say nowhere to be seen, but very, very limited amounts. So in terms of, let's say, the gap, the other areas that Europe has not yet really mobilized, that is one where we see on investment relationships much less deep relationships than what we see in the case of the United States.
It's very interesting to think about always trade and investment and see how they relate. You just mentioned that the geopolitical distance in investment is falling twice as fast. And this is also interesting because at the end of the day, investment is really longer term. Like when you think about investment versus trade, investment is investing in the longer term in a country, whereas trade is a bit more short term. So I wanted to continue on this topic on investment, and maybe you've already developed a couple of thoughts on data centers, semiconductors. I would like to hear a little bit generally on the technologies that are normally thought as technologies of the future. Also, like, for instance, AI, electric vehicles, batteries. How important is the EU as a market, and how important is also the EU as a producer? And here I'm also referring to the very interesting report MGI published on how FDI is shaping industries today and how this is shaping the tomorrow of these industries. So can you elaborate a little bit more about how this is shaping as a producer and as a market?
So I think a nice place to start there is to just recognize that Europe is pretty big globally. Okay, so when you look at just trade on the whole, almost one of every $2 of trade either starts in Europe or ends in Europe, or starts and ends in Europe. That's also the case often. It's the biggest trading bloc. It's the biggest trading partner of a lot of economies around the world. So Europe matters from a global scale. The rub, the nuance here, is that when we look at what we sometimes call the big arenas of competition, and I'll define those in a second, but when we look at the industries that are basically the most dynamic, seeing the most growth, the most intense competition, generate outsized returns, account for most of the market cap, like we looked at a bunch of indicators, but there's a series of industries that over the past 20 years kind of ticked all the boxes in terms of this is really where you want to be, okay? These were things like consumer electronics. These were things like e-commerce, a lot of software. These were areas like payments. So basically the areas that shaped the economy, the global economy of the past 20 years. When we looked at Europe specifically in those arenas, the picture looks very different. So let me give you a number. For these arenas, the US accounted for about 60% of the market cap. China was the second with like 20. Europe was about 10%. So it's a completely staggering different world when you look at really the industries that have shaped the current global economy. And so what we asked ourselves is, are we going to see a repeat performance of this? So Europe missed a little bit of the boat over the past 20 years. Is Europe going to miss the boat again when we look at the next 20 years? And the answer is nuanced. I think what we see is that Europe has pockets of strength to build from, But we do see indications that it's not moving at the same speed as, in particular, US and China in some of the other industries. So let's talk about a few examples. Chips, right? Everyone loves to talk about chips. In particular, it's really interesting to look at what we call leading edge, what the industry calls leading edge semiconductors. So these are the smallest of the chips. These are the most energy efficient, the most advanced. These are the ones that, you really want to crack the code on. Today, Taiwan and South Korea account for roughly 90% of these leading edge chips. Staggering. Let's play the movie forward. What do we think is going to happen over the next years? Well, when we look at, again, let's look at capital as the forward-looking signal. We see massive projects breaking ground in the United States. Project those that, by the way, are sponsored precisely by the Taiwanese and South Korean firms that have cracked the code, right? So they cracked the code at home, and now they're investing in the United States to create new fabs there. The kind of TSMC project in Arizona is the most, or one of the most well-known ones. And the other kind of big one is Samsung in Texas. So when we play the movie forward, what we actually see is that the United States might actually reach about even more than 20% of share. So from very, very little today to it could reach about 20%. So the United States is clearly moving forward in this industry. When we look at Europe, much more limited signal. So the good news is that actually Europe today already has some leading edge production. This is something that not a lot of people know, but this is in Ireland today. And there's like new investments to actually expand. This is an Intel fab. There's investments going in to actually expand that fab. So Europe will also get a little bit more production, but nowhere near as the United States. Now, I did mention that Europe starts with pockets of strength, and that's also the case for semiconductors. ASML, I think it's a story that we all like to tell, how Europe actually accounts for essentially all of the production of the most advanced EUV lithography machines that go into the making of semiconductors. But depending on where you look in the value chain, in some steps, and in particular, the one that people tend to pay the most attention to, which is actually making these leading edge chips, Europe behind certainly Asia and behind the United States, even when you play the movie forward. To give another example, electric mobility, right? So automotive industry used to arguably be the crown jewel of European competitiveness. And I think we all know that we've seen in recent years, Europe's position in that industry deteriorate. So again, let's play the movie forward. What are we seeing now? Well, the good news is that obviously Europe starts with a lot of expertise in this industry. The other piece of really relevant information is that Europe has attracted the most investment from Chinese battery and automotive players. And these are the players that today in electric mobility actually hold the leading edge of technology. So it's not the leading edge chips, it's let's say the leading edge battery technologies. They are investing in Europe, creating new facilities. So then a little bit of the question for Europe is, to what extent will those facilities actually spur innovation domestically, lead to increased know-how domestically or not? Because one of the things that we have seen time and time again when we look at history is that these investments are essentially a seed. They give you the potential, but then they have to be nurtured. You have to water them. You need to make sure that the ecosystem around them actually is able to absorb the know-how so you can actually spur growth locally. So again, these two examples, I think, both paint a little bit of a similar story, which is Europe is not at the leading edge of some of the industries of tomorrow. There's some opportunities to spur growth, but definitely more would have to be done if Europe is to take a leading position in some of these.
Actually, if I could ask a follow-up question, because I thought it was really interesting what you said about planting these seeds and minding the growth. Could you give examples of some policies that are successful, or at least trends that show this growth happening?
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking of, look, historically, what are some, let's say, successful examples of, let's say, going from the seed to a very productive field, right? I think actually the case of South Korea for chips is really interesting because it did start with a lot of FDI and then mobilized by a lot of, let's say, smart moves to actually build out an industry. Another known example, if we think of Europe, has been cases like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia in the automotive industry. A lot of investment from kind of the big European automakers during the 90s that actually created a local ecosystem. Or maybe a third example, the case of Vietnam with electronics, also attracting a lot of FDI during the kind of 2000s period, building out a massive industry on the back of that. So when we looked at a bunch of these historical analogs, what we essentially found is that there were kind of three loose rules that led to success. The first one was the ability to mobilize domestic investment. So FDI is not enough. You need to combine FDI with domestic investment. So FDI is the seed, but then you need to fertilize it. You need to because the amount of capital that you can mobilize is generally much bigger, especially if you're thinking of a place like Europe, a place like the United States, much bigger domestically than just foreign capital can do. The second one that we've seen a lot is actually building out the ecosystem around these projects. So you might want to branch upstream, you might want to branch downstream, you might want to have service providers around it, but basically integrate more and more domestic companies into this ecosystem in the way that you can actually get learnings out of it. Sometimes we talk about absorption capacity. So absorption, if we think of a sponge, like are we soaking up all of the learnings that we can from these, let's say, leading edge projects? And then the third one, and this goes a little bit again to the idea that you do need global connections, they're not going to go away, is did you actually then integrate with the global value chains or the regional value chains orchestrated by the leading players, right? So in the case of Central Europe growing up in the automotive industry, that was integrating much more with Germany or integrating much more with France in those value chains where the know-how existed. So this goes a little bit to this idea that these industries, I'm going to use a bit of jargon, but I'll break it down in a second. These industries are what we often call winner takes most. There's not going to be 100 very large semiconductor players. There's not going to be 100 large battery manufacturers. So you need to make sure that you get to the scale either domestically or by integrating with the big players that actually can compete at this global scale. So this integration continues to be very, very important.
Trying to conclude, we've talked about a lot of the industries of the future, which are driving a lot of the capital. But taking that into account, and also a lot of the traditional industries and global trade, what does this all mean for the future of global economy and for Europe's place in it as well?
I think this gets to the part of the conversation where making predictions about the future is really hard, right? But I think there's a few things we can say. We can say that, look, when you look at the global system of connections today, a lot of it was forged during what we sometimes call the golden age of globalization, kind of the 90s, the early 2000s, where trade was ramping up much, much faster than the economy as a whole. And so we built a system of connections that prized efficiency, right? We really wanted the most efficient system possible. And generally, let's say, concerns about geopolitical sensitivities and geopolitical distance and all of these concepts we talk about today took a back seat, right? So you basically created a system that has either vulnerabilities or things that are perceived as vulnerabilities. So you can think of Europe importing a lot of energy from Russia a few years ago as one of those. You can think about the fact that the leading edge chips all come from Korea and Taiwan. You can think about the fact that China today now accounts for more than 80% of battery production around the world. I could go on and on. But basically, we created a system that raises questions about, is this sustainable over the long run? Now, what we see then when we look at the future is that the wave of new investments that are coming in create the opportunity to move to a different type of system. When we look at semiconductors, these new projects could increase the capacity outside of Taiwan and South Korea by 6 times. It could increase the capacity of batteries outside of China by 5 times. It could increase liquefied natural gas capacity by 30% and from new places, from Argentina, from the US. So it's basically cross-pollinating, right? We're creating new sources of capacity that let us look at the potential of a system that's, let's say, less risky, or at least that risk is different than the risk profile that we have today. So this is the big implication of the work that we see, is that we might be building a world where some of these connections are somehow more resilient. The caveat that we always have to say on this is that this is a potential. These projects, many of them have broken ground, but not all. So history, if we go back to history again, tells us that about 70% of these projects will actually probably come to life and be real. 30% will fall through the cracks at some point. And that as we build this, yes, we are building new sources of supply and connections that might be more resilient, but at the same time, we need to build new relationships to make this work. So it is up to individual companies, individual economies to think carefully about the sort of connections that they actually want to build for the future. But FDI is the seed. It's providing the opportunity to actually build these connections.
Thank you so much, Tiago, for your insights. I think especially for me coming from a background quite far away from this. It's such a good and clear explanation of the things that are going on that really give me a base to better understand the world. And I hope our listeners also got the same impression. If you are interested in entering a conversation on the things that you heard in this episode, feel free to drop a comment. We post about this podcast usually on LinkedIn and Instagram, so you can find us there. And you'll hear from me next week.